I'm Kayla Dice, and this is Your Life Path. I'm an out-of-control tabletop role-playing game designer, and on this show I talk to TTRPG designers and other exciting guests about everything that inspires or influences them away from role-playing. My guest today is someone I'm very excited to have a conversation with. My guest is the brilliant Aaron Lim. Aaron, thank you for coming onto the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience more fully?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm Aaron Lim. I'm he/him pronouns. I am a game maker and occasional games lecturer based in Petaling Jaya in PJ in Malaysia. And I make tabletop games and I put them up on generally just on my itch page. That's me. That's pretty much it. We'll get into more
What do you think
details
are the...
of this, so.
I guess the top also might help because I think the audience always hears an interesting mix of people who are familiar with the guest versus people who follow the show. If people aren't familiar with your work, what are some of the things they might know you from? Even if they don't recognize your name, they might recognize the work.
Yeah, sure. So I like I mentioned, I make tabletop role playing games. I ran a Kickstarter for a story game called An Altogether Different River. It's part of Zine Quest back in 2021. I just released a story game called Spectres of Brocken, which is about young mech pilots getting to know each other and then years later ending up fighting a war against each other in giant mechs. That came out at the end of 2023 and just is available physically from Indie Press Revolution just this year, and I've also just released a supplement. I worked with a bunch of really cool guest writers to put together a supplement for different playsets for Spectres just recently as well as we're recording. And I also run a thing called Playtest Zero, which is a fortnightly playtesting event. That's probably the thing you'll hear me talk about the most often because I just make sure that people are aware that we run every other week. We've been running that since 2021. It's an online tabletop role-playing games playtesting meetup. We meet for about 2 hours and we try and get through 2 games, so we have to kind of limit people to an hour per game, which means we don't get to playtest really heavy games or systems, or we can't playtest for a long time, but hopefully what it means is if it feels low stakes enough, you can bring stuff that is pretty early stages or just portions of games that you'd like to playtest and get through a lot, and we can try and get through a lot more regular playtesting. And that happens every other week over at the Session Zero Discord server. We don't have the Discord invite link out in public just because we don't want a lot of spam. We've had problems with bots previously. So if you want an invite, just send me a message on social media or email or something like that. And that's something that we do. We do 2 sessions. One that is geared or one which timing is more convenient for people in the Southeast Asia region, so it's in my Malaysia local time, and in that one we get people from say Philippines, Singapore, India, and even some from the US sometimes if they wake up early, and we have a second session that is geared towards US time zones, so it happens early in the evening for Pacific and slightly late. We kind of have to split the difference between Pacific and Eastern time for that one. So yeah, that's the stuff that I do. That's what you might know from. Yeah.
Thank you. So I like to start off asking some sort of biographical questions, and obviously we're going to dig more into your individual games, but sort of starting off, I'd basically like to know, could you tell me more about where you grew up?
Yeah. So I grew up in Klang, which is a port town in Malaysia. I think actually I don't know how many people are familiar with Malaysia, but like our capital is KL or Kuala Lumpur. We're about 40 minutes out from the capital. So it's not a small town; it's a pretty big town. But it has a reputation for like being a little bit rough. Um, just because like it is still a port town which tends to have a lot of like crime links, right? Because of like smuggling and all of that stuff happening all through that. I think that's pretty typical with port towns all around the world. They tend to be a little bit seedier. Um, sailors just like driving all the property prices down. I don't know about that. But yeah, I grew up in Klang, and it's interesting because I think in Malaysia I'm kind of like in between. I was thinking of it as like I'm not indie enough to be in like the alt comics space, for example, right? Like to use comics as an example, it's like you have DC, Marvel, and then you have like Image, Dark Horse, and then you have like Fantagraphics and all the other like more alt underground comic stuff. So I'm not there. I'm like I'm at Image, Dark Horse levels. So it's like I'm like I'm not from like a small town in Malaysia. Like Klang is pretty big, but it's definitely not like the center of things. And so there's always been like a little bit of like a underdog feeling of like, oh yeah, we're not in the big city, but we're also not that small, right? So it's always kind of like in between. Yeah. So it's like I don't have enough of the independent true underdog cred, but still holding the grudge against like the big cities, right? Which is something that happens in like a lot of the stuff that I enjoy in like media and like in the way that I make things as well. Thinking about it now.
Yeah, it's interesting
Yeah.
though how like those sort of similar dynamics can repeat in lots of different places because I also think that's a similar relationship where I grew up, which was 40 minutes from London, where I have to the city, where it's like, oh, that's kind of what makes our place interesting, but also we kind of resent it. But then also we need to acknowledge that we don't live in like small rural towns, isolated. So it's definitely a strange sort of dynamic there. And usually from here, like I ask like how the sense of where you grow up informs work. And obviously with your work when it comes to like Homebound and altogether different river, this like relationship there is actually like really telegraphed. So a slightly different question I want to ask at this point, because we're going to dig more into those specific influences, is do you find you're still sort of thinking of where you grew up when you're writing things that are not so explicitly about that? I guess I'm thinking of Spectres of Brocken. Do you feel like there's a lot of your upbringing in that, even if it is more subtextual than what we see in more explicit work?
Yeah. Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think like I'm of the opinion that like regardless of what you do, whether you consciously want to bring it in, like it will kind of like reveal itself in your work, or like it'll creep in there and like sneak in when you're not aware. Like what I mentioned, right? Like the idea of like being the middle town, not big enough to be the city, not small enough to be a small town. It definitely kind of like influences a lot of how I think about what the default person is that like I think of like that plays games, right? Like I try to be cognizant of like where that there are people who like play a lot of games and like are super like well versed in like a lot of different things, and there are people who like play like a few games, or like they don't have as much access to a lot of these things. to a lot of like different experiences, right? Like, so I try to like, so that kind of like does inform the way I think about like, yeah, like I mentioned, like what is a default gamer? There's no such thing. But like trying to like find ways of making sure that you never forget the context of like where you're in. And I think the 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 thing about that I find with like the creative work, like you mentioned, like Homebound and Altogether Different River are very 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 obvious about it. But like with Spectres, it also feels like sometimes like the topics that I choose, right? Like Spectres, I think is very funny in that like it's a mech. It's I position it as a mech game, right? Like the trappings are from like the mecha anime genre, but a lot of the mechanics don't have to be about mechs, right? But I love that genre, and it is also a genre that is not quite uh not quite like underground indie. Like it's a like mecha anime is like a long running like long standing franchise, but it is also not like hyper mainstream. So it kind of like also like I mentioned, it influences the type of thing that I like I it's like because of this healthy disdain for the metropoles. It's like I don't want to just do mainstream stuff, um but I haven't had to but I've had the privilege or like the access to mainstream stuff enough that I don't feel like I need to express myself in ways that are like very super countercultural, subcultural stuff. So I find myself even in the culture like in a midpoint, right? Um, I think that's probably the most kind of like telling thing about um like that I see about like where I situate myself like geographically and culturally is at this like weird midpoints. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
and just to
You're not
also
feeling the need to like
bring it up.
reinvent a new language to how you're communicating your work, but at the same time you're not feeling the pull of doing like the biggest and most dominant form of genre or such.
Yeah, like I generally really don't have a huge desire to do like normal heroic fantasy stuff. Like everyone says like, oh, you have a fantasy heartbreaker in you, right? For like tabletop RPG stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I like fantasy games. I do. I play them. But I don't feel like that huge need because it's like, oh, everyone's doing that. It's fine. I'll play someone else's, right? I don't like I not to say I haven't made them, like I have, but like it's not like a big thing that I'm like invested in. Um,
Mm.
yeah. And to also bring it back, like we talked about where I grew up, which is in Klang, and like I studied like closer to the city and like had all those feelings about like, oh, I'm not quite like with the city folk, but also not really rural. And then I moved. I had the privilege, I guess, to move to study overseas, and I studied and lived in Melbourne, Australia, for close to 15 years. And Melbourne is a big city, right? It's not the biggest city in Australia. It's I think people tend to think of Sydney when they think of Australia. Um, and Melbourne does have that slightly, yeah, we are the cooler, lesser known sibling, um, which was different, and because I can't say like I'm from like a smaller town anymore. I'm like right in the big city, but like that also helped like shape a lot of like, but it also wasn't like hyper mainstream. So that shaped a lot. Like Melbourne's like arts culture, and view towards like arts and culture was quite formative as well. And I also credit a lot of that to the independent video games scene in Melbourne, who I ended up if you're interested in like nerdy stuff, like you know if you're interested in playing tabletop RPGs or like board games in a small city, you end up getting to know video games people because like you just end up playing games with them, right? Like you see them at conventions and stuff. So it's like I ended up um, um, getting quite acquainted with like the indie video game scene, and that was a huge impact.
Yeah. So, what was it you did study when you moved to Melbourne? Like, what was it that took you there?
Ah, yeah. By training, I am a civil engineer. So I studied civil
Ah,
engineering in Melbourne, and I never got like certified as an engineer. I ended up graduating into the global financial crisis back in 2009, and 2008, 2009, and then uh, but I still got like related work. I worked in a project management for construction projects. So not engineering, but on the project management and planning side of things. So my work is like mainly Gantt charts, Gantt
do
charts and
you
schedules.
feel like that sort of project management background in some parts? Do you think that informs how you approach projects which involve lots of different people, or do you think that's one you figure out in this own space?
You'd hope so, right? You'd hope so, but I mean, I in a way, in that like the basic principles are the same, right? Like you know, have all like figure out who your stakeholders are, what your inputs are, what your you know what's the ultimate goal for your project, and make sure you have all of that planned. Make sure you build in contingency. All those principles are there, but like a lot of the specifics are so different, right? Um, until I got to actually doing it, like figuring out like, hey, when do I do the art? When do I do the layout? When do I do the editing? For like putting a book together is like, you know, you still have to learn like the specific skills, which is different than you know, just knowing the general how to keep things on track is not enough when you haven't actually done it yourself. Which is a thing, you know, like it's a learning from like working in the construction industry, and especially because I worked in consulting, so I was not working directly for a builder or a contractor. I wasn't just doing um, like long term on like a single project. I ended up being put on multiple different projects. So I've done like roads, bridges, buildings, um, data centers. I, yeah, that kind of like I had to do a lot of like different things, which I think that's probably the thing that I learned the most, was just to be flexible and like to kind of like respect, um like go in with enough respect for like people who know the space, to not like I know some people say like consultants just come in and they don't know anything and they tell you what to do even though they don't know anything, but sometimes we do that, but like because your bosses the bosses who hire us are terrible, but like when we are able to actually get in there and like get buy-in from people, and like we all realize that we want is the best for a project, and learning from people who are already embedded and know all the processes. um, that's how I've tried to approach, like, you know, shifting some of those skills over. It's just like trying to learn from people who've done it before, and to be patient and like not try and like do too much at once. It's like to me, I feel like I need to cultivate like a healthy respect for like the process and like the experience that other people have, and like I basically it's like, you know, do small projects, do a bunch of small projects, learn skill, get the skill up along the way, rather than like try and like do too much at one go. Is one of the main things, I think.
Yeah, it's all about learning your own pace, learning what works best, and also knowing what other people know best and letting them have sort of space to do that. Um, I did just
Yeah.
remember another question that sort of occurred to my mind when you were talking about like imagining audience and what kind of like their exposure to games what, like, how many kind of games they play. And I guess it brought up an interesting question because I feel sometimes when I am writing a game, the audience I tend to imagine, maybe not necessarily in terms of how they'll discover it, but in terms of, I guess, how I think their mind works, is I'm just sort of imagining, well, how would I feel about this if I'm encountering it in a different place? But I honestly don't always think that's the best thing because I don't think I represent the average role playing gamer at all. And this was a very roundabout way of arriving to the question, like, what was your first sort of introduction to tabletop role playing games? How did you find yourself in that sort of space, scene, and art form?
Yeah. Um, yeah. So I I first encountered role playing games by like reading about them online, right? And I had no idea what that was all about. I would have been like 14, 15 at the time. Um, so I should say like my interest in like tabletop games started very much with like card games and board games to start with, right? So I started playing like the Pokemon trading card game, right? And then I played Magic um and like I've always wanted to make games, but it started from there, from like um c- uh, ca- card games and then into board games and then to tabletop role playing games, but um so I think that I like to do and I tend to do is like I like to do a lot of research when I get into something. And when I was like looking at it, like, okay, like I want to make my own like card game. I like read all the rules for like all the card games that I could find, and I found that like okay, obviously Magic is the biggest thing. I should learn how to play Magic. I learned Magic by reading the comprehensive rules, by the way, um, which is not something I recommend. And then I realized that I think Wizards had bought TSR at that point, and were releasing third edition. That would have been in the early 2000s, and I was like, oh, what's up with this thing? What's up with this like weird new game? New to me, right? And I was interested in it, and it's like, oh, it seems very cool. And um, but I was on the internet, but not allowed to like do a lot of like it's not to say not allowed. Like my parents probably wouldn't have known if I had gone to like internet forums and stuff, but I just was wary of them. Um, and so I had no idea how to find other people who knew how to play like Dungeons and Dragons, right? Um, so I I pirated the PDF of Dungeons and Dragons Third Edition, and got it printed at a print shop, and tried to read it. It was in black and white, printed out of a and then like with like plastic binding. Tried to rope in a friend, and like we read it, and it's like, okay, don't really know how this works. Um, Made plans to like try it out and never got around to it, and then promptly forgot about it. Until later on, like I was still like, okay, I still know like what this thing is about, and I didn't actually figure out how it worked until fourth edition came about. And Wizards did the really smart thing of putting out podcasts of like how to play fourth edition. I think
Ah,
they did the Penny Arcade guys, and I think there was a Robot Chicken podcast as well. Um, and so that's how I learned to play the game, by listening to other people play it. So I had no idea. So it's like it finally clicked, right? Like many years later, like one edition later, like I couldn't figure out third edition just by reading the book, right? It's just too confusing to me. It's like what do you mean someone has to make up everything? Like where's the like I think crucially I had not downloaded any adventures. I had not pirated any of the adventures. Just the DM handbook and the player's handbook. Um, um, yeah, so I didn't actually figure it out until fourth edition. And then I got my friends to play it with me, because at that point in time we had a very regular board gaming group. And the way I stealth introduced Dungeons and Dragons to them was to get them to play the Castle Ravenloft board game. Um, Castle Ravenloft there's a Castle Ravenloft simplified version of like 4th edition as a single big box board game, and I used that. So we played that, and it's like, hey, did you know that we could play like a full campaign of this rather than just what's in the board game? And then it's like, cool. And then that's how I started playing 4th edition. So that's kind of like where I went into it. And after the like how to play like podcasts, I was looking around for like other podcasts to listen to, and I listened to the Critical Hit podcast from the Major Spoilers Network guys, and they were a 4th edition actual play podcast, and I also learned about like other indie RPGs through that, because when they weren't playing the campaign, sometimes they had like Q&A stuff, and the DM Rodrigo would or some of the other players would also bring up other indie RPGs, and through that I became interested in like trying other indie RPGs. I think Microscope or Fate might have been the first one before Microscope, but Fate and Microscope were the two early like indie RPGs. I think Fate was having a moment at that time, like everyone was trying to play Fate. Yeah, but yeah, that's kind of like how I got into it. And very much, I think that the experience of how I got into it very much influences how I think about people get into role-playing games, because like that first instance of trying to just learn from the book by myself, and it being so confusing, still like still influences how I think about like how simple some of these concepts should be explained.
That does tie into a question I was going to have later, but I think it does really make sense as a sort of jumping off point, because there are definitely other games I've also tried to just read through, and I've been like, oh yeah, I reckon if I heard this, I'd completely understand it, but I'm not connecting there. And what it is I find like sequencing a really important part of any text, like the order being introduced. And I know there's lots of different approaches. I know some books that are doing it's like, oh, you're encountering the rules as a player would encounter them via playing the game, versus ones like you're being given an overview or stuff like that. And Spectres of Brocken features 2 rule formats. Like there's basically suggesting a short form version for different needs, as well as like at the start just going like, oh, if you just need this, read these parts. And yeah, I wanted to know more about like both like how you approach that sequencing, how you thought about the fact of like it's not enough to just offer this one order, we should also offer like an alternative thing. And then I guess also how you've approached different games in terms of sequencing of rules.
Yeah, it's tough because like especially like if you have games where like there's always the question like, do you introduce the core mechanics first, or do you introduce like character creation first? Like, do you get people invested in who you are, what your role is in the game, before you get invested in like the some of the engine underlying all of that, right? And I think there's no right like one size fits all answer. It kind of depends on the rule set, and it depends on like the well, also sometimes the format, like how many pages do you have. Like one of the reasons why we ended up only with 2 rule sets for Spectres is that I didn't want the book to be huge, because like otherwise I could have seen myself like putting like 3 different rule sets in there. Like if you had the luxury of like an expanded format, or like different different tools that you can provide along with just a book, right? Then you can do a lot of different things. But I was limited by the budget, by what we had with the Kickstarter with Spectres, and so I thought the best way to do that was just the two rule format thing that it currently has, which is something that I also took up from Fantasy Flight Games, how they do their rule books, and Root, the board game Root, also has a a split between the rule book you read when you learn the game and the rule book you read when you know the game and you're playing the game and you just need a reference. So Fantasy Flight used to do like, here's a how to play rulebook, and then here's a reference rulebook which has the rules. And I mentioned about like learning Magic the Gathering as well from the comprehensive rules, which is silly thing to do because the comprehensive rules is a rules reference and is written like a law document. Honestly, like, you know, if you, I don't know if you know how like Magic judges have to like take tests of like rules knowledge, and it's like you need to know that like, oh, which order do like layers apply in, and it depends on like where it's written in rulebook, and like, you know, it's like 6.8.1.2 applies before 7.B.3, right? So you need to know the order of
God, yeah, that makes sense in
that
the way
kind of
like
stuff.
referees or judges in any competition must have to do that, but also is
Correct.
wild
So
to imagine.
because yeah, they had to do that because they had a tournament system in place where people play for a lot of money. So they were incentivized to like have a rule book that was consistent and clear, right? I think a lot of games don't need that. You know, although you should, you know, there's war games rule books that are written like that as well, and they don't have the motivation of like massive prize money tournaments, just pedanticness. But like that's where I got it from. And Root also has the same thing. Root actually has 3 rule books actually, which is why I mentioned like, if I had like infinite budget for Spectres, right? Like you might see 3 rule books. So Root has a step by step. Here's what you do exactly for the first 2 turns of the game tutorial mode. So it tells you like, play this card, like pull out these cards, play these cards, do this, and it will demonstrate all like the concepts in the game. It also has a book that has a more abstracted, not step by step, but like, here's how to play the game. And then it has the Law of Root, which is the rules reference that has the specific rules that you might need to reference when you are already familiar with the game and you just need to resolve like conflicts and like how certain cards interact, for example. So all of those is like why I ended up doing the 2 rule format thing. And it's also because like when I play, like say I play Follow, which is one of my favorite games by Ben Robbins, and like I read the book, but when I run the game, I don't bring the rule book. Right? I give people the summary of the rules, and I explain the rules to them. I don't need the players to like play to read the whole rule book. So I know that like there's usually a way to like present the game, and then you just need like the reference sheets when you're actually playing, and sometimes like when I need to flip through the rule book, like because the reference sheet is a summary and I need to like reference something else, it's like I want to make sure that the rule book is formatted in such a way that you get to that information quickly, right? Because in those scenarios, speed is better than clarity. Speed is more important than clarity. It's like I mean, clarity is important in the sense that like you need clarity to enable the speed, right? But I want to be able to find the rule book, the specific rule for this situation quickly, rather than like, here's how to play the game and here's how to like set it up, and here's
It's
how
not
to,
a chronological
yeah.
read, it's a dip in and dip out with what you need.
Yeah. So and I also found like when I was playtesting and like when I put up like different versions of Spectres on itch throughout its development, and the initial rules document for Spectres was like 8 pages, right? It's like it doesn't, like when you boil it down to it, if you are already familiar with the game, I only need those 8 pages to run the game, right? So I knew that I could run the game based on 8 pages, and so I wanted a version of that in the Spectres book. Um, um, yeah, because I don't need like the 80 pages version. I need the 8-page version of the game.
Yeah. So it's so interesting. I know like card games often are very good for having like a single card, which is a here's your reference, and they've compressed it into that,
Mm.
which obviously also like having an individual card printing budget is its own thing, but it's an interesting thing that like certain TTRPGs could or try to adopt. So jumping along to some of the other questions I had, like Homebound, which is a compilation of games, and an Altogether River, which I actually first bought on Altogether River at UK Games Expo last year because it was being sold
Oh,
in physical copy at the Soul Muppet stand, I think. And I was working there, so I just was while looking for a song. I was like, "Oh, I'm actually just going to put this aside because I want to buy it at the end." But sorry, that was me getting off track. They're both very informed by the period of your life in which they were written, and you're very open about that in the text of both games. And I was really interested in your feelings on disclosing that influence and talking about it so explicitly in the text, which is reading that is something I find so fascinating.
yeah. I think that's definitely a thing that that's definitely a thing that comes from my interest in um, games as like an art form, right? As a medium, is like um, as as like ways that like designers can make statements about their games, like having artist statements coming along with like a work. Um, I don't think all games need that. And I think Homebound and Altogether Different River are special cases for me. I don't think I would do that for most games. So I think those games in particular, those two projects in particular, because Homebound and Altogether Different River are kind of like very linked, right? They are in my mind. You know, and Altogether Different River doesn't exist without Homebound. So those two projects are kind of like one and the same to me. And because those games are specifically about me trying to figure out what I wanted to do with making games and making tabletop RPGs, because I had not actually worked with tabletop RPGs before then. I mean, I had I'd hacked 4E. Everyone has like done like homebrew stuff for like their home games and stuff like that. But that was like me trying to like, hey, I want to do stuff as a designer um, and very much influenced by the indie games scene and what was happening in and around like indie games and like personal video games that was happening in Melbourne, and very very influenced by the Free Play Independent Games Festival, which is a independent games festival that runs in Melbourne, that I was lucky to have as like a community and as a space to like see what other like game makers are doing, right? Um, because I do believe in like the potential for games to be personal and like artistic works, um, and I believe that for video games, and I believe that for all games, which means like for tabletop RPGs as well. So and a part of that is like sometimes like if you're gonna treat it seriously, then I think you I think part of that is also because like when I made Homebound and um specifically Homebound, like I was not very tied into other parts of the community in terms of like I had not really been talking to other tabletop RPG designers, right? And so one of the reasons why I put a lot of my personal feelings about games and making games into Homebound is because I had not been able to talk about that with other people, right? And that project was about kind of like, hey, I want to make games like this, right? And it's a statement of intent, and like I want to keep exploring making games in this space, and um, Homebound was a pretty personal project. There's a version of Homebound that is only available to my friends, and that version is not available elsewhere. It's very minor differences. Mainly the photos that are used in there are like actual photos of me and my friends. Anyway, so when I realized that because Homebound was a I kind of have to explain what Homebound is to kind of like get into like why
Sure.
it makes sense for that game specifically to have those clear like artist intent statements in there, because Homebound was made um, uh, at the tail end of my time in Melbourne. So I had lived in Melbourne for close to 15 years, and I was going to leave. In that time, I had spent a lot of time, and I had grown and I had grown and like come to love like the community of like people, like game makers, or people who just love playing games there. And like I love games even before moving to Melbourne, but like I think it really flourished when I was there, and like really influenced the way I thought about like games. Like without those people, without that environment of people around me playing and talking about games, I don't think I would be like the person I am today. And so I wanted to kind of like pay tribute to that, to like the people who had influenced me, and the way I think about games as like an important part of my life. So I wanted to make and knowing that I was leaving Melbourne and leaving that community behind, to move back to Malaysia permanently, I was like, okay, yeah, I can, like, I will talk to people, right? like I did, like, spend time with friends, like talking about like what it meant to leave Melbourne, but I also wanted to talk through the medium that we shared a love for, which was games. So I put together 3 games that I had made in Melbourne, and all of them are thematically linked in that they are all about like home and like going away, leaving home. Um, and so I presented that, and like I gave that out as like a farewell gift to friends, and because for some of the people that I gave to, we had never actually really played like tabletop role playing games together. Like we are like board game buddies, or like I knew them from like playing multiplayer video games together, right? So they might not have known that I had that intention to like make tabletop RPGs. So I felt like I needed to like explain myself and like what I wanted to do, why I was doing this. And so that's part of why Homebound is like so explicit and open about like everything that went into it. And it makes sense for that project because like that is a part of it. That is a part of like using games to like communicate with people. And altogether different river, I think is a less that, but does try like make a reference to like how it came about because of Homebound, because an altogether different river was supposed to be in Homebound. That was supposed, and it was supposed to be a companion game to that ultimately. And I think the place I've ended up is that like I ended up doing a designer's commentary version of An Altogether Different River, which just has like it's basically a commented PDF. Partly because like in my day-to-day work, I work with commented PDFs a lot. That's a lot of how like we give feedback to each other. So it's like it's a format that I'm familiar with, and also it's just fun to like read comments on a PDF, and so I did that, not really because I had more to say about like I think I had more to say to people directly with Homebound, but with An Altogether Different River, like it's kind of in that mode, and I wanted to like find new ways to like talk about the game making process, because like I love like blogs and like stuff like that, but sometimes it's really hard to find that supplemental material, right? And I thought it would be nice to just have a version of the game that is just like commented. Yeah.
Yeah, I read through the designer commentary, commented PDF as well as the regular version here, and I think it was really interesting to inform my perspective on the games, and that is what I enjoyed so much about like the sort of like explicit artist statement that forms part of Homebound. Like I always find it really interesting to read that stuff and really see like just a bit, I guess, a bit deeper into the creative process that happened, while also I completely understand how it's not the right match for every project at all.
Yeah. 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 I think people should do that if it makes sense. And it is really fun. I think designer commentary on like books, definitely I want to see more of that. Just because like sometimes it's like I don't know where your blogs are. I don't know where your design blogs are. Like sometimes I just pick up the PDF, right? Um, so it's nice to be able to like see some of that already in there. I know some other people have also done similar things, and like that's always cool to see.
So, in the commentary on Far From Home, which is one of the games included in Homebound, you discuss feeling the desire to explore the immigrant experience, but feeling a lot of stress and concern about your ability to do so fully. And I, from a not relating to the immigrant experience based on my experience, but I remember feeling a lot of that when I have made games that in some sense like foreground transness. It gives me a sort of, I think, a sort of similar nerves. And I guess I was wondering, how does it feel looking back on that game? Have your feelings about being representative of your experience in your art changed since then?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I think that's definitely the feeling of someone who's like putting out their first game. You know, um, like that feeling of like putting out Far From Home was like I had never like really made like a serious game before. I had made like board games. I had made card games that don't really deal with any like personal uh, uh, issues at all, right? It's like very easy to just like, oh yeah, it's just a fun game. Like it means nothing. It's not that it means nothing, but like there's aren't any stakes to it, personal stakes to it. But that one did, and that was the first time I did that. So obviously, looking at it, it's like, yeah, it makes sense that I would be nervous, right? And a part of that nervousness is also like just my discomfort with like representation politics, in the sense that like of how limited they are, right? Um, of like I don't want to like I can only talk about my own personal experience, right? But Far From Home like goes a little bit into like stuff that is not my own personal experience, and so there's nervousness about like, hey, like uh I can't vouch for like everything in this game is like completely personal, right? There are parts of it that are more personal than not, but like there are parts of it that are borrowed experiences, right? There are experiences from my friends who I empathize with and understand, but like could never fully, represent, right? And that's the limitations of like representation, right? Like that there's too many to there's too much complexity to be able to like distill down to like simple good representation, bad representation, right? Which is something that I find myself struggling with in terms of like talking about like representational like methods, and like how that's being put forward in like mainstream um, art, I guess. So a lot of that nervousness is like changed over time, right? Like now I've like made other games, so it's like I don't feel as nervous about some of those parts, in the sense that like, hey, I think I've had like 4 years on that. It's like, hey, I think I've got a little bit better of a handle on myself and my skills as a designer, that like I would not feel as much stress and concern. Like I still want to like keep that as like that is something that I think about and like focus on it, or more like to keep that in mind, like to always keep that in and not like have that cockiness of like, oh, I'm good now, don't worry about it. Like I think like that will always like even putting that out there and like telling people that like, hey, I'm fucking afraid of this game, is a way to like remind myself that like, you know, I should be I should be a little bit afraid of like some of the games that I put out. It's a healthy fear to have, I think. So I have tried to keep some of that while also like telling myself that like, hey, I think like, you know, I've had 4 years. I think I have some of that and I'm in a different place right now, right? Like I've moved back to Malaysia and I'm dealing with like different things. We all had to deal with a thing that happened like 4 years ago. Everyone's like like post 2020. I mean, we're still in the pandemic, but like post 2020, post the lockdowns, like everyone's feelings about placeness and um, being able to like move and migrate like might have changed in 4 years
Mm,
and grown more complex.
yeah, definitely. I think also, yeah, for me, I'm often thinking like, oh, I'm wanting to represent my experience in this, and my experiences are going to be informed by things like transness or mental illness, but I don't ever want to be putting out a game and trying to present it as this is the trans experience TM, this is this experience of mental
Yeah,
illness
yeah.
like TM, the official version, because I acknowledge they're all different, but then I also don't always want to say, hey, here's my list of qualifications to talk about being
Yes.
trans, because that's not necessarily always owed to the audience either. And it's a thing I do find just sort of, yeah, really fascinating and worth sort of like contemplating and grappling with, and maybe never always having this full, complete sense of calm and comfort of, yeah, it's been 4 years, I've got it nailed.
Yeah. I mean, in 4 years you learn more about stuff that you don't know. As in, like you learn that like, oh shit, like I there's even more that I don't know.
Totally. So shifting gears. Oh, that was a fun play on words for Spectres of Brocken. That's a game in the mecha genre, and you also have two other mecha games that you're working on in 2024. You write in Brocken how part of the appeal of mecha for you is mechs and armor anonymize combatants while still being a vector. And you list a series of touchstones, some of which are in the mecha genre, some of which I think Spider-Man 2 is in there, which is obviously not, but also I loved seeing that because I'm like, oh yeah, I can see how this is slotting in here. And basically, I was wondering if you could just expand on what informed your version of this genre space, which is such a wide genre space that plays in so many different ways.
Yeah. I, I think there's a lot of things that like mechs stand in for, right? Like obviously um they are about like amplification of power. That's one thing. Like that's all. That's a lot of technology though, right? Like the gun, the tank, the car. Like that's all like about amplification of power, and a mech is also that. And then there's mechs as like idealized bodies, right? I think some of the like Iron-Blooded Orphans, for example, in the Gundam series has like interesting things about like what it means to have an idealized mechanical body when you are disabled, right? Like there are people, and I think Thunderbolt as well. Thunderbolt Gundam has like a disabled protagonist, and like they have accommodations to like pilot machines, and like why do you have accommodations to pilot machines? Because you get injured in war, and they still want to put you into like the the fucking robot to continue, um, like like disabling other people, right? Like that's all really interesting. But I think the thing that I mentioned is like a part of that is like the thing about the mecha genre is that ultimately they are military weapons. They are weapons for they are force amplifiers. Yes, they are idealized bodies, but ultimately they are weapons. Um, and a thing I find really interesting about weapons is like not just about their capacity to harm, but in their capacity to distance you from harm. I think that is very like interesting to me. Like how modern warfare is like involves drones, where like you can feel like you're playing a video game and not realizing that you're killing people at all, right? That dehumanization of people like in modern warfare is really interesting. In like, we want weapons that kill but also absolve us from killing, right? It's not just about like, hey, we want to be kept safe from the consequences, but also mentally we want to try and keep ourselves safe from like the spiritual mental consequences of what we are doing with violence as well. And I think that's really interesting in like modern warfare, right? Like that distance that we want to put. And like mecha are really interesting in that they do both, right? In that like you don't directly injure someone. Like if you blow a mech's head off, like that person's head is still fine, right? Oh, I lost my main camera. I you destroy their arm. Like it's not like they lose their arm. Evangelion notwithstanding. um, but yeah, so like the idea about anonymizing combatants is about like the dehumanization of like people, but we still want mechs to look like people. We still want or at least a certain genre of mechs that look human, right? Compared to like spider tanks or and even those are like interesting in their ways of like how inhuman they are is also interesting, while still like encasing a human body and like trying to uh, abstract out like the violence that's being done. So I think that's really interesting, and I think specifically for Spectres, right? Because I Spectres is not a military sci-fi. It's high drama. It is a soap opera game, right? So like all of that is thematically rich and interesting, but like the part that like makes the engine run for Spectres is that like, oh, you could be fighting a friend and not knowing. This is why I brought up the Spider-Man 2 touchstone, right? When Harry hates Spider-Man so much and like asks Peter to like help him find and kill Spider-Man, like not knowing that that's ooh, that's so juicy. You know, like that's the personal human part of that, like the consequences of that. Right, we know the industrialization and like mass like anonymization part, like that's a factor of it, and then make it personal to like not know that you could be killing like your best friend, you know, you would never know. And that's like drama that's moving from wow that's moving from war is bad to like not wow cool robot, but wow cool drama, wow cool boys that should have kissed but are now killing each other. Yeah.
Yeah, it's weirdly enough, in a very strange way, it reminded me of a quote in The Third Man, which is when two characters who used to be friends and now are on sides are up in a Ferris wheel. And one is essentially making an argument of like, look at these little dots down there. If I told you get $2,000 for each little dot that just blinks out, would you start counting them as real people? And it's like literally height, like a literal physical height, reducing people to small things that no longer look so much resembling humans, and using that to anonymize violence. And his friend there is a bit horrified by it, but also what he's far more concerned about is how his former friend is treating someone he literally knows and sees. And it's that similar thing of just being war and violence, sort of like, anonymizing or sort of altering the ways you think. But thinking about that sort of like the focus of like military weapons, I find the way that the Academy Inspectors is conceived as like a specific site of control really, really interesting and striking. And ultimately, as a former teacher, I think it rings very true to how a lot of educational institutions are set up. And I was wondering what informed that conception there.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I took from Far From Home actually, and this came from like a challenge from someone who gave feedback on the game. Um, I believe it was Steve D who gave feedback on the game that like helped me like sharpen what ended up being circles. Um, was in Far From Home. Um, I needed so in that game you play as like various immigrants that like live in a hegemony, right? But like a lot of like other games, it's like, oh, why would all of you why would all your characters interact, right? I needed an excuse for like people to interact regularly, right? Or like even if you're friends, like how did you become friends? Like for me, like my personal experience is like through university, right? Like I moved to Australia to study, and so a lot of my friends that I made were friends from uni. And so I used that as like the example. So like, okay, yeah, here are different ways that like you might tie your group of characters together. Um, and like it's fine, it was functional, and I can't remember the specific feedback, but it made me think about like, wait, what am I trying to do with the like what's interesting about like these people being connected together, like by education or by like if we all became friends because we work together, right? Like what are the things that tie us together? And then the idea of circles was that like, oh, it's something that ties you together, and you think that it is something that is like a good positive thing for the community, like you're building bonds with each other, but or you're getting something from like the hegemony, right? Like I went to like study in Australia because I thought that I would have better prospects, like a better education in Australia, like quote unquote better. So there's something that you want from them, but then the trick is that it goes both ways. That's the way that hegemony controls you, right? Like that's how they extract value from you, right? You come here, it's either like building soft power or literally extracting money from you in terms of like fees, um, um, or like extracting your labor, right? Or like thinking about like I went there and like became like professionalized labor, but one of the most common immigrant experiences is as manual, hard, often indentured labor. Um, is the most common like immigrant experience you think. Um, and so it's about so the circles are like sites of control and of extraction, right? And I remember that like when when coming to talk about the academy, it's like, okay, this is also a similar thing to circles in that like I need all of y'all to like be friends, right? And obviously the trope that I pulled on is the school days, like you're young and like getting to know each other. I think I mentioned in like Spectres that like my initial inspiration is Break Blade or Broken Blade, which had like the three main characters. Oh, they studied in a military academy together. Um, and then later on finding out like, oh, Fire Emblem Three Houses also has them study in a military academy together. Um, um, and to remind people that like, yes, it's fun to like do like school stories right now, but remember that there's a conflict phase coming up in Spectres, that you're all going to be involved in a war, and the war doesn't start from nothing, right? uh like remember that like the war starts in school, like the war of ideology has already started, the war for control over people has already started, like even like school is not innocent. There's no innocence in the academy, is the thing that I wanted to kind of like, I mean there is innocence in the, there's some innocence in the academy, it's not no, but like I want to remind people that like it's not just all fun and games, like mechanically I wanted to I wanted that so that you start thinking, even in like your happy fun time school days, you already know it's going to end in tragedy, so I want to make sure that like you start thinking about that. And the way to do that is to remember that like, oh yeah, yes, like schools are still like sites of control, and
Yeah,
um like who's going to convince you to fight for your country? Someone in school.
Yeah, totally. I like, so as a teacher in the UK, like legal obligations I had where if I was technically not doing these things, I was breaking the law included. I needed to be instilling British values, which was really fucked.
Yeah.
And obviously, it was more a case of reframing general school values that they would then say, "Oh no, this is uniquely British," and I'm like, "Is it? Is it really? Sure about that?" But also, it's like, like technically, if I ever discouraged a class to distrust the government or break the law, that was technically illegal. That was technically against my allowance as a teacher. And as a teacher in education, all I thought was like, the best I'm managing here within this system is subverting it. But it's not innocent, definitely. And it's something that, yeah, just from multiple perspectives of having been to school like many people and also then having seen another side for it and become greatly disillusioned, it rang true, and really there's definitely a thing. I can see how it makes the eventual conflict phase so much sort of like juicier in terms of its dramatic potential. So moving onto some other questions, which I guess are more about your like process in general across different games. One thing I wanted to ask was, does music play much of a part in your process?
Yeah, I put the theme song thing into Spectres as like it's an optional um it's an optional rule in Spectres that you should pick a theme song for your character, and I only made it optional not because I think I think you shouldn't engage with it, but I know that like when we're done playtest, it's like we can spend like 20 minutes just like going through songs and like picking out songs. So I wanted to make it optional for time reasons, basically, because people get really into it and
Yeah.
like no, and then we like tell each other you got to listen to this. So I made it optional not because I think that it's like mechanically not fun or whatever. It's just it's really because of time, because we did spend enough. Yeah. I think games should embrace like music a lot more. Um, I am not like a really good musician or anything like that, but like I just love like how much emotion like they can bring, and like how they can inform like character stuff. Like I know people love like making character playlists and like finding like theme songs and stuff like that. That's really fun to do. I just because of the way the games that I'm currently like released are not so straightforwardly like I tend to like games that are like very like my favorite games are like Microscope and Follow by Ben Robbins are like very like, oh, you can put whatever setting you want in them, right? And then you can pick play sets. So when I'm writing the general like framework of the game, I don't I try to listen to like, you know, like when I work with on Spectres, I definitely put on like Gundam soundtracks or like like anime like hype music soundtracks, and then like when I'm working specifically on each of the world tendencies, I was like, okay, I didn't put together a specific playlist, but I tended to like, okay, here's the vibes that I want to listen to while I'm working on this to like get in the right headspace. And I know that a lot of players do that as well, right? Like character creation, they might, even if they don't make a playlist for the character, they might like, oh, this is like the music I associate with this. And that's also really, like really influenced by like, I think I'm a big fan of like Friends at the Table, the actual play podcast, and the way they use music is I think exemplary. And the theme songs that they have like evoke so much, and like yeah, so I'm not like I know I think Sam Lee is like the game designer. I think they do like playlists and stuff for like their games and stuff like that. So I'm not to
Yeah.
the level of like making like game playlists. Um because I'm just like, okay, just put the Gundam Unicorn playlist in there. That's what I listen to when I'm doing the Orbital Century like thing. I just have that on repeat. It's kind of boring. So, but I do really love music in games.
Yeah, I am someone who will both make a lot of playlists for characters if I'm ever like starting a campaign and if it's a world or setting where music can work with that. And so I really enjoy when a game is essentially allowing me to indulge that impulse as part of play. And also I am someone who sometimes tends to like make playlists for designing stuff, though other times I'm just like, yeah, the soundtrack to this is this album or this compilation or this random Spotify playlist I found. Because yeah, I can
Yeah.
often find it's like a connective tissue to, or like almost like a vein to tap that gets me in a certain kind of mood.
And
And
I think the other thing
speaking of like,
sorry to
oh no, yeah, you go.
sorry. And then one last thing about music is that like, I am not like a poetry person. Like I don't read a lot of poetry and all, but I tend to not think of myself primarily as a writer. I think stylistically I'm very boring. But in terms of like stuff that I find like really resonant is like music lyrics. So for me, like poetics is like very tied into like music lyrics for me. So it's like I tend to like for example, I like to write moves and like description and stuff, and I think of like, oh, this would make a good like song title. So that's the way I engage with that, because like I never like studied poetry or that kind of like or like creative writing, right? So for me, a lot of my inspiration comes from like, oh, this is a sick song title, this is a sick band name.
I like that for moves. Definitely in games that rely a lot on moves, I do think that's a great way of understanding the impact of something. So focusing on like another medium that like intersects and can interact with like the writing and designing of TTRPGs. I was wondering how visual art informs your writing in the development process, because across multiple projects you've collaborated with different artists, and in that same sense I guess I was also wondering like, what is your attitude to collaboration? I imagine this might be informed by the project management work you've done, but also I imagine creative collaboration does manifest like in subtly different ways.
Yeah, I think where I'm at right now is I'm on a learning process. So I think of like all the project that every single project that I've done like has been like a training project. In that like, hey, like an altogether different like Homebound was like that's my first time putting together anything physically. An altogether different river was the first time I ever like fulfilled anything like outside of my friend group, right? Um, and then like Spectres of Brocken is the first time I'm working like with an editor and a proper like layout artist rather than just doing it myself, right? So every step, every project that I've done, I've learned something new. So like I still think of them as like training projects. And so in a similar way with like working with artists and like with visual art, like I'm still learning from every like person that I work with. Like for example, uh, uh, and altogether different river, I worked with a local artist, Vanessa Tang, and she was the one who like, hey, I'm just gonna put all the different iterations like back and forth, like feedback and everything into Google Slides. So we have a whole like timeline, like it's almost like a timeline of all like the changes and all the different drafts that we've gone through of like the of the cover art. So I've used that process when talking with all the other artists that I work with as well. And I try to like learn like what their process is like and like work with that. We haven't like strictly gone with the Google Slides every time, just because like, you know, with some artists that's not what they're used to. So I try and like fit with what they are comfortable with. And I'm still at the point of like I'm still very uncomfortable with like art directing people. Like I'm very much just like, you're the artist. You know, I kind of there's a reason I wanted to work with you. Like because I trust like your visual language and like your interpretation of stuff. But like learning that like just because I've looked through their portfolio and like I know what they want, doesn't mean that they know what the vision for the project is, right? So I need to be able to communicate that to them and say, okay, this is exact. These are the specific things, or like going through their portfolio and like, hey, these are the images that like really drew me to want to work with you, and I think it works particularly for this project. Like for example, when I worked with Alex Connolly on Spectres for the interior art, I purposely wanted stuff that like felt a little bit more industrial, um, for or like more grounded for some of the artwork. Um, so I had to tell him like, okay, this is specifically the tone that I'm looking for. Or with Amita Sevalaraja, who did the cover for Spectres, was not like she's not like a mecha artist, right? So like when we first started talking, it's like, oh, I'm not sure how comfortable she was like doing a cover for like a game that's ostensibly about mechs, but like talking with her and like trying to like, look, you've done other stuff that is about like this bombastic like emotional um um like very kind of like iconic images of like in more of like a fantasy vein, but like evokes that sense of like awe and scale, and like a very strong like design sensibility, like for shapes and colors specifically. So it's like that's why I wanted to work with you. It's just trying to be able getting better at like learning how to communicate that with artists, because I personally still feel like I would love to be able to give like more free reign to artists, but like trying to find that middle ground of like, look, what am I trying to get at versus what you are trying to what you are able to bring. It's very fun. It's very I think it's very fun for like learning like each person's like preferences and like styles, right? Um, so so far I've always done it in a way where I already had the project and then I engage an artist later on. I would love to work on a project where I work with an artist much earlier in the process to like develop the vibes and feel of the game. But I haven't done that because I still feel like I don't have the confidence to be able to communicate that well, and like I'm only building that confidence like after like Spectres, right? Okay, I've like before that I was like, oh, I've only communicated with one artist before, or like two artists, because Cecile, who did the cover for Homebound, um, um, that one was like a pretty quick knock in the park, because that one I had a very clear vision of like what I wanted to do, so that was easy in a way. But it's like, okay, now I feel a little bit more comfortable like being able to communicate. I think the core is like communication, right? Like just trying to get all of that like I'm not like an artist, so I need to learn how to talk to artists and like get that kind of like get both of us on like a, a united vision, or like a vision together. Yeah, it's really strange in the sense that like I think artwork is part of like the design of games, but like so far the way I've worked hasn't really like reflected that, and that's more because of like my own like I feel it's like my own kind of like nervousness about like experience working with art. I put together like mood boards for like games, like particular images that I think are like really important. Like for example, the Spectres one, which I ended up sending to Amita as well, like has like some of the influences that we talked about, like Gundam, like Spider-Man. I didn't put a Spider-Man 2 image in there, but like I wanted to make sure like, okay, these are the touchstones of like the stuff that I'm thinking about, like so um so I tend to have the visual identity of the game kind of like sketched out early on, but I'm not very tied to it. It's just like sometimes it's just like I just need something to like help me push things along during the design process, and like but I'll try to be flexible like with other people as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so much of collaboration is kind of about like trying to set people up to do the best work in the easiest way possible, and so much of that is about like learning someone's individual rhythm and like what works for them. Like I also feel like having only collaborated with like two artists so far, and like seeing like, okay, these people have like really different preferences for like how they work and how can I meet that so I'm setting them up best. But it's definitely always about like the learning curve of something.
Yeah.
I am something you said reminded me of another question I had where you said I think you said something like you don't always consider yourself much of a writer, which like as a fan of your work I'd maybe disagree with, but I did, I guess, wonder. One question I've been asking people is, do you remember when you did first consider yourself like a writer or first consider yourself a designer? Is that like a clear moment you have a memory of, or was it just like, oh, it happened at some point?
Yeah. I guess to clarify is like I don't consider myself like a good stylist, right? Like I don't uh like uh like I think there are writers that I look up to in like the tabletop RPG space who are really good at like evocative writing. That I understand that that's not my skill set, right? Like I come from I come from like uh very technical report writing kind of thing, and like I came from like board games was like a lot of my background. So I like to think that I'm pretty good at being like or like I try to be like if I'm not as good a stylist, then I want to be better as like someone who can write clearly and explain things in a direct, simple manner. It's like it's more like that's my goal rather than like or that's the niche that I find myself like tending towards, like yeah. uh and I kind of like settled on that like pretty recently, and like understanding is like, look, I do want to be a better writer, I want to be a better designer, but I need to be honest about where my strengths and my weaknesses are, right? And like if I want to be a better stylist, then I need to read more, and I need to read more that is than just like the stuff that I like reading already, right? Like I talked about like song lyrics and like poetry just now because it's been on my mind of like, look, I think like poetic cadence and stuff like that is really interesting. It's a really interesting part to incorporate into like games writing, and it's something that I am not familiar with, right? That's why I brought that up, because it's like, oh, okay, like I'm trying to like learn like places that I'm not familiar with, because like I come from I come from like, hey, project planning, writing reports, right? So I don't I still don't consider myself fully. I guess it's more because like I call myself a game maker and a game designer more than I call myself a writer, because like that's not the craft that I focus on. Doesn't mean I'm not interested in it, but like I'm very like motivated to like get better at like the design part, and I think of the writing as part of the design, right? Rather than writing in itself. This is why like I don't really write fiction. I don't really write like other stuff. I don't like write essays a lot. Like I think of writing as like a tool for like game design. So I think of myself as a game maker and a game designer first and foremost. And I guess when I very cockily, I like if I'm being really honest, like I'm actually like I I like to think I have a healthy ego. I don't think it's gone overboard yet, but like when I was like 14, 15, I already considered myself like a game designer. Like I thought like, yeah, I'm hot shit. I can make my own games. Um, uh, yeah. So I had that confidence, maybe misplaced, right? You know, as a teenager, thinking that like, oh yeah, I'm so good. Um, um, but I've kept that in the, not in the sense that like I think super highly of myself, but like more like I never considered failing as a game designer. Like I never considered myself a failure as a
Yeah.
game designer at any point. It's like, look, I'm a game designer. I'm gonna continue making games. If I'm bad at it right now, I won't be as bad tomorrow. I will get better. So I think I've thought of myself as a game designer from a young age. Is the true and honest answer to that. Like unfounded confidence. Never finished a game before, but thinking of myself as like, I can do this from like 15.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really on board with that because I think you can grow into misplaced confidence, but you have to learn to defeat insecurity. Whereas, like, if you've got the confidence, you can develop the skills that are going to match that, and you can be who you always thought you were eventually. I am going to move on to like the last question of the episode soon. But first of all, just thank you for coming on. I've really enjoyed this conversation and getting to know more about your process and your thoughts. Before I go to that last question, can you tell the audience where they can follow you and keep up with your work? Because you are obviously continuing to work on lots of exciting things.
Yeah, so on social media, I'm Aaron Lim everywhere, like EHRONLIME on the bad website, on Twitter, on Blue Sky, which I'm trying to get in the habit of using more. On co-host as well, which I actually really love co-host's vibe. I'm just bad at long form writing, and I feel I this isn't like a thing. It's just like I feel like obligated to write a little bit longer if it's on co-host because everyone is like writing really cool, longer posts on there. So I like, oh man, I feel the pressure to like keep up. I should just get over myself for that one. But you can find my work on itch.io, ehronlime.itch.io. Yeah, like that has links to like all the other stuff as well. So that's probably the best place to like keep up with what I'm doing.
Yeah, I also always recommend if you like a creator, you should follow them on Itch because you will get an email anytime they release something. If you are otherwise like,
yeah,
say, like dropping off of social media or stuff, doing that follow is a great thing. But yeah, thank you again for coming on.
No, thank you for having me.
This has been the life path of Aaron Lim. I have been Kayla Dice. Thank you for listening. Good night.